Picture the dead of winter in the eastern woodlands. The air is so cold it burns the lungs, and the snow-choked pines stand in absolute, heavy silence. Suddenly, that silence is violently shattered. Not by the sharp crack of a flintlock musket, nor by the whistle of a war arrow, but by the concussive, earth-shaking roar of heavy artillery. A mortar shell arcs through the freezing air and detonates, sending lethal cast-iron shrapnel and splintered timber tearing through the tree line. We are taught that the 17th century in North America was defined by an unstoppable Iroquois Blitzkrieg. The historical consensus paints the Five Nations as a supreme military force that rolled over the continent like an inevitable tide, erasing all indigenous opposition from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. But the colonial archives hide a different reality. They hide the cold, mechanical truth of a people who stalemated the Iroquois war machine for 25 years. What happens when a society of apex hunters bypasses the colonial gatekeepers, acquires European cannons, fortifies their settlements with geometric precision, and dictates the terms of a global fur market? It ceases to be a skirmish in the woods. It becomes a technological dead end for an expanding empire. History is never what you think. To understand this anomaly, you must immediately strip away the myth of the primitive, uncalculating frontier. We are not looking at an Indian war. We are looking at a highly organized, ruthless conflict for control over the primary trade corridors of North America. And in this conflict, the Susquehannocks, known in the terrified dispatches of the Dutch as the Minquas, were absolute pragmatists. They were brilliant logistical operators who understood the brutal mechanics of the New World better than the Europeans who claimed to own it. The Dutch West India Company held a stranglehold on the Hudson River, funneling firearms exclusively to their Iroquois trading partners in the north. The Susquehannocks, dominating the massive watershed of the Susquehanna River to the south, realized a fundamental rule of survival. Bows and arrows could not secure a trade corridor against Dutch steel. They needed an engineering baseline. Instead of fighting a losing battle of attrition, the Susquehannocks simply bypassed the Dutch monopoly. In 1638, the Kingdom of Sweden established a colony on the Delaware River, New Sweden. The Swedes, commanded by the heavy-handed governor Johan Prince, were desperate for a foothold in the lucrative fur trade, but lacked the military manpower to push into the hostile interior. The Susquehannocks recognized this desperation and forged a highly lucrative, militarized syndicate. If you look at the trade manifests of New Sweden, you do not see trades for glass beads, brass kettles, or woven blankets. The Susquehannocks demanded a hard industrial currency. They traded prime beaver pelts by the thousands. In return, they did not just ask for basic hunting rifles. They demanded heavy-caliber matchlock and flintlock muskets, massive reserves of black powder, lead molds, and most crucially, heavy artillery, specifically iron swivel guns and small mortars. They essentially bought their own military-industrial complex. But owning a gun is useless if you cannot maintain it. The Susquehannocks actively sought out Swedish gunsmiths to train their own warriors in the maintenance of firing mechanisms, the casting of lead balls, and the precise measurement of powder charges. By the mid-1650s, they had transformed themselves into the most heavily armed indigenous force on the Atlantic seaboard. They did not fight like a disorganized band of raiders. They fought like a corporate military entity, utilizing European ballistic technology to secure total dominance over the southern trade arteries. By 1663, the Iroquois Confederacy recognized that the Susquehannock logistical monopoly was an existential threat. The Iroquois had exhausted the beaver populations in their own trapping grounds. To survive the global economic market, they had to push south. they decided to permanently liquidate the Susquehannock anomaly. The western nations of the Confederacy, the Seneca and the Cayuga, amassed a strike force of 800 elite warriors. In the context of 17th century North America, an 800-man indigenous army was a staggering projection of power. This was the ultimate kinetic payload of the era, a force that had recently wiped the Huron and the Erie nations completely off the map. They marched south in the spring, expecting to easily overrun the Susquehannock towns with sheer numbers and aggressive shock tactics. But when the Iroquois vanguard arrived at the primary Susquehannock settlement on the western bank of the river, they did not find a traditional wooden palisade. They found a European-grade fortress. The Susquehannocks had not just bought Swedish guns, they had absorbed Swedish military engineering. They had constructed formidable, deeply entrenched defensive architecture. Historical surveys and colonial accounts describe a massive structure equipped with corner bastions. These bastions were the pinnacle of European siege engineering, protruding angles built into the walls that allowed the defenders to create overlapping fields of enfilading fire. Any Iroquois warrior attempting to rush the main wall would be caught in a deadly, mathematically precise crossfire from the flanks. Beyond the bastions, the Susquehannocks had dug deep, dry moats and raised heavy earthworks, backing the heavy wooden palisades with dirt, mud, and rubble to absorb incoming musket fire and prevent the walls from being burned. The Iroquois did not face a woodland skirmish. They were forced into a brutal, static siege. The Seneca and Cayuga attempted a mass infantry charge, carrying dry brush and torches to burn the gates. When they threw themselves against the walls, they were met with a horrific reality. The Susquehannocks did not just fire a volley of muskets. They unleashed coordinated artillery barrages. Iron swivel guns, mounted directly on the bastions, were loaded with grape shot. Tightly packed bags filled with heavy lead balls, nails, and jagged scrap iron. When fired at close range, a swivel gun does not kill a single man. It clears a geometric lane of human tissue. The artillery detonated, tearing through the massed Iroquois ranks with devastating kinetic force, shattering bones and severing limbs. The elite warriors of the Confederacy bled themselves dry, trying to breach earthworks designed to withstand professional European armies. The psychological shock was absolute. For the first time in their history of conquest, the Iroquois Blitzkrieg was halted not by a superior number of men, but by superior industrial architecture and heavy ballistics. When the Iroquois offensive finally exhausted its momentum, breaking upon the walls like water against a stone, the Susquehannocks did not celebrate in the safety of their fort. Recognizing the shift in momentum, they opened the heavy timber gates and launched a devastating, highly disciplined counterattack. Armed with heavy war clubs and steel tomahawks, they fell upon the disorganized besiegers. The Iroquois force was completely routed, leaving their dead in the mud and fleeing north in a frantic, uncoordinated panic. The Susquehannocks were not defeated by the Iroquois. They were defeated by the cold reality of a global systemic failure. The conflict for the trade corridors of North America was entirely dependent on the distant, shifting geopolitics of European capitals. In 1664, the Anglo-Dutch Wars redrew the map of the continent. The English Navy seized New Netherland, and in the process, absorbed the territories of the Delaware River. The Swedish colony was already gone, swallowed by the Dutch, and now the English controlled everything from Boston to Virginia. Instantly, the Susquehannocks' primary logistical artery was severed. The British implemented a strict, continent-wide colonial consolidation. The surrounding colonies of Maryland and Virginia, deeply fearful of a heavily armed, independent indigenous nation, sitting on their borders, enacted aggressive embargoes. They cut off the sale of powder, lead, and replacement parts to the tribe. In the unforgiving mathematics of war, a cannon without black powder is nothing more than a cold, useless cylinder of iron. A musket with a broken mainspring is just a heavy wooden club. You cannot forge lead from river stones, and you cannot synthesize saltpeter from pine needles. The technological edge that had kept the Iroquois at bay evaporated almost overnight. Simultaneously, the true apex predator of the continent bypassed the moats and the bastions, Variola major, smallpox. The disease was catastrophic. Unlike a kinetic battle, which primarily kills young men on the front lines, the virus performed a targeted eradication of the entire human infrastructure. It swept through the densely packed, fortified town, killing with horrific efficiency. Crucially, the virus wiped out the specialists. It killed the veteran gunsmiths, who knew how to repair a shattered flintlock. It killed the artillery operators, who understood the exact powder charges required for the swivel guns without bursting the barrels. It destroyed the military engineers who possessed the institutional knowledge to maintain the structural integrity of the bastions. The virus dismantled the mechanics of the fortress from the inside out. Without the specialists to operate the guns, without the powder to fire them, and without the diplomatic leverage to buy more, the geometric walls became a static, infected tomb. Weakened by demographic collapse and starved of ammunition, the remnants of the Susquehannocks were eventually forced to abandon their great fort, falling victim to a renewed, relentless Iroquois offensive in the 1670s. History is a cold, brutal game of endurance. The Susquehannocks were a terrifying anomaly in the system of 17th century warfare. They played the game of European logistics and ballistics better than the colonists themselves, proving that a native nation could adapt to the industrial age, build defensive superstructures, and fight an expanding empire to an absolute, bloody standstill. But their ultimate erasure provides an unforgiving lesson in military reality. You can possess the finest artillery, you can build the most advanced architecture on the continent, and you can field the most disciplined soldiers. But if you do not control the manufacture of your own ammunition, you are operating on borrowed time. When the supply chain breaks, even the most impenetrable walls will eventually fall. The collapse of the Susquehannocks was the last true technological resistance before the British Empire fully clamped its iron grip over the eastern seaboard. The silence that followed their defeat was not the peace of a conquered land. It was the absolute silence of a rusted cannon sinking into the mud of an empty forest.